Hey guys, today I'm going to share an incredible and transformative story that will change the way you view New Year's celebrations. It is the moving account of a near-death experience, where shocking revelations were made by none other than Jesus Christ. Before we start, let us know in the comments which city you're watching. And, of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that inspires and challenges you to think beyond. Let's go on this journey together. On the night of December 31st, 2023, St. Gabriel Medical Center was more chaotic than I had ever seen it. New Year's Eve in Miami is known for its splendor, fireworks, endless parties, music, and dancing. But for us in the emergency room, that meant traffic accidents, burns, overdoses, and sometimes irreparable tragedies. The shift started as usual, with my friend Lucia joking about New Year's resolutions. "Rosa, this year I'm going to stop drinking coffee at 3 in the morning and sleep like a normal person," she said with a laugh, adjusting her glasses and passing the clipboard to me. "Good luck with that," I replied, trying to keep up with the emergency rooms that were already filling the rooms. At 9 p.m., the situation began to worsen. The emergency radio kept beeping with mass casualty calls. A 3-car collision on I-95 brought in 10 patients at once, and the smell of blood and alcohol seemed to permeate the air. Among the patients was Mariah Thompson, a 17-year-old girl who had been thrown from a car during the impact. She was conscious but in critical condition. As I tended to her, Mariah held my hand tightly, her green eyes filled with tears. "I'm going to die, aren't I?" she whispered. "Not while I'm here, darling," I replied, trying to hide the tiredness in my voice. While monitoring her vital signs, I noticed a slight pain in her chest. I thought it was stress. After all, the hospital was in chaos. But as the night progressed, the pain became a constant pressure. Lucia noticed something. "Rosa, are you okay? You look pale." "It's just the rhythm of the night, Lucia. We have more to do." At 11:58 p.m., the pain reached an unbearable peak. It was as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. Mariah's monitor started beeping, but I couldn't react. My vision went black, and the ground seemed to collapse beneath my feet. Everything around me turned into an eerie silence. The last thing I heard was Lucia screaming my name. The next second, I was no longer there. The moment my vision went black and my body gave in to the relentless force of pain, I felt an inexplicable lightness. It was as if something had been detached from me. Then I realized I was floating. There was no pain, no confusion, just an almost serene curiosity about what was happening. I looked down and saw my body lying on the stretcher. Lucia was leaning over me, her hands pressing on my chest as she tried to revive me. Dr. Ernesto Valdez, always calm and direct, now seemed agitated. He gave rapid orders while the team around him worked in sync, connecting monitors, applying defibrillators. I saw my own face, pale, still. It was strange and disconcerting. "Rosa, don't do this to me. You promised me dinner on Friday." I heard Lucia scream, with tears in her eyes. I felt a pang of sadness at seeing her like this, but I couldn't get closer to comfort her. The vocals began to distort, blending into an indistinct murmur. Time seemed to slow down. I noticed something curious. The sound of the heart monitor, which should have been a constant indicator of life, was now a straight, constant line, a buzzing sound that echoed in the room. "One more load now," Ernesto ordered. A burst of bluish light crossed my field of vision as the defibrillator was triggered. It was like a crack that reverberated in my consciousness, but I felt nothing in the body below. Then something else caught my attention. It wasn't the hospital, nor the chaotic scene in the emergency room. It was a light, a presence. To my right, an opening began to form, glowing with an intensity that didn't hurt the eyes. The light seemed alive, pulsing, inviting. "That's not possible," I thought. But before I could articulate any doubt, I was drawn away like a leaf in the wind. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to resist. Everything around me, the room, the voices, the sound of the machines, disappeared. As I approached that opening, I realized I was not alone. I felt a presence, comforting and familiar, even though I couldn't see it clearly. She seemed to guide me, as if to say, "Come, Rosa, don't be afraid." I passed through the opening and was enveloped by a tunnel. The tunnel walls were not solid, but made of light. The sensation was of movement, but without wind, without effort. It was like I was being carried. At the same time, I felt a warmth that enveloped me, a deep love that transcends any earthly description. And that's when I saw, at the end of the tunnel, a figure. She was surrounded by a light so intense it almost seemed part of her. It was not an indistinct silhouette. It was a concrete, real presence, emanating a serene authority and indescribable love. "Rose," said the figure, her voice reverberating like music in my heart. It was at that moment that I understood. I was not simply dreaming or imagining. I was facing something, or someone, much bigger than I could ever understand. When the figure called me by name, a wave of peace and recognition ran through my being. I didn't need to ask who it was. Deep in my soul, I knew. I was in the presence of Jesus Christ. His voice had a tone that was both tender and full of authority. It was as if every word carried eternal weight. "Pink," he repeated, with a smile that seemed to light up the entire space. "You were called here for a purpose. It is not your time yet, but there is something you need to see." I felt a mixture of reverence and curiosity, but I said nothing. Words seemed unnecessary. He reached out his hand, and when I touched his fingers, an indescribable warmth enveloped me. It was as if all the love in the universe was concentrated in that gesture. We began to move through the tunnel of light. He wasn't just a passerby. It felt alive, pulsing, and each pulse felt synchronized with the beat of my heart, or what I believed to be the sound of my heart. The walls of the tunnel were not solid, but made of a substance that seemed to flow like water and shine like stars. I saw little flashes of scenes within the light, moments from my life, smiles from patients I had helped, tears I wiped away. "Why am I here?" I asked finally, finding the courage to break the silence. "You have always served others with love, but there are things you still don't understand," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "Today, you will see truths that will transform your outlook on this world and the next." Suddenly, the tunnel began to expand, and I felt as if we were crossing time and space. Every second seemed eternal, and yet the movement was rapid, like a thought that forms instantly. Far below, I saw images of Earth, small lights flickering in cities and towns, but also areas of darkness, like shadows cast over humanity. "These lights," he said, "represent the choices people make. Some shine with faith and obedience, while others are dimmed by practices that turn them away from me." As we advanced, I realized something that seemed impossible. I could feel the emotional state of the people below. In places where the lights shone brightly, there was peace and hope. But where there were shadows, I felt despair, emptiness, and an incessant search for something that would never be enough. "Rose, I will show you the origin of the practices that have shaped much of what you know," he said, looking at me with eyes full of compassion. "Not to judge, but so that you understand the spiritual impact of human choices." The tunnel began to transform. The surrounding lights became brighter, and I realized that we weren't just moving, we were moving towards something bigger. He held my hand more firmly, and I felt that what came next would be something that would change everything I believed about life, death, and the world itself. As soon as we exited the tunnel, the scenery around me completely changed. We were no longer in an ethereal light, but in a vast, vibrant field of colors and sounds. It felt like I had been transported to another time, another era. People were gathered in a large stone square, adorned with flags and sculptures representing ancient gods. There were drums playing intense rhythms, priests chanting, and crowds offering sacrifices to an imposing figure of a god carved in stone. "This is the Akitu festival in ancient Mesopotamia," Jesus explained. His voice was calm, but loaded with meaning. Here, people celebrated the new year with rituals that mixed gratitude and idolatry. They invoked the god Marduk, seeking blessings for their crops and protection from chaos. I looked around, fascinated and, at the same time, restless. People seemed excited, but there was something dark in the atmosphere. I realized that celebrations had a cost. They believed they need to make sacrifices to please these gods, I muttered, mostly to myself. "Yes," replied Jesus, with a tone of sadness. "These practices not only separated people from the true God, but also perpetuated fear and manipulation. Man has always sought ways to control the world around him, often resorting to rituals that opened doors to destructive spiritual forces. Suddenly, the scene changed. Now, I was in a desert land, but rich in golden monuments. It was ancient Egypt, and people celebrated the birth of the god Ra with dances and processions. I saw priests holding torches and sacred symbols, while a crowd worshipped the rising sun. These celebrations marked the beginning of a new solar cycle, Jesus explained. They believed that the sun was the manifestation of a deity that controlled their lives. Although they recognized the power of creation, they stopped worshiping the Creator. Each scene seemed more revealing than the last. I was transported to Greece, where parties in honor of Dionysus involved wine and excess. Then, to Rome, where the god Janus, representing transitions and gates, was celebrated with parties and offerings. In all of these cultures, there was a pattern: celebrations tied to time, harvests, and change, but deeply rooted in idolatry. Finally, the scenes became more familiar. It was like watching modernity being born before my eyes. I saw fireworks, parties, champagne glasses rising at midnight. Miami appeared with its vibrant energy, but behind the modern celebrations, there were echoes of the ancient practices I had just witnessed. "They don't see what goes on beyond the surface," said Jesus as I watched. But the spirit of these celebrations remains the same, a mixture of unconscious worship and practices that distance people from true communion with God. I felt a deep sadness when I realized how much we ignored about our own traditions. "But it's just fun," I muttered. "People don't know. They mean no harm." "Yes," said he, with infinite compassion, "but ignorance does not protect them from spiritual consequences. That's why I'm showing you this. They need to know the truth." When the scenery changed again, I realized I was no longer in ancient times or festivals of past civilizations. I was floating above the contemporary world, observing the bright, vibrant cities, each seeming to compete with the other in grandeur. Fireworks exploded in the sky as crowds celebrated the arrival of the new year. Jesus was at my side, looking on with a mixed expression of compassion and sadness. He stretched out his hand, and the landscape below became clearer. I could see the streets of Miami, with parties in luxurious apartments and crowds gathered on the waterfront, counting the seconds until midnight. I saw families gathered in their homes, watching fireworks on television, and young people filling clubs and bars, laughing and drinking. "What do you see, Rose?" he asked. "Happiness, celebration," I replied hesitantly. "People seem free." He nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. "Take a closer look." Suddenly, my vision expanded, allowing me to observe not only actions, but also what was happening on an invisible plane. I saw shadowy shapes surrounding seemingly innocent people, whispering in their ears, encouraging excess and irresponsible behavior. On a street corner, a young man was arguing with his girlfriend, the alcohol increasing the tension until he exploded in anger. In another scene, a drunk driver got into the car with her friends, laughing and starting the engine. I saw families that, despite being together, were emotionally disconnected. Parents looked at their cell phones while children played alone. At a local church, a group of Christians had organized a New Year's vigil, but some of the participants seemed more interested in snacks and conversation than in prayer. But they're not doing anything wrong," I argued, feeling defensive. "They're just living, trying to be happy." Jesus looked at me, and his expression softened. "Rose, intent often doesn't match spiritual impact. See what happens on another level." He raised his hand again, and now the consequences of his actions were clear. I saw a car accident on a highway, the result of reckless driving after a party. I saw children crying as their parents argued violently, their arguments fueled by alcohol. I saw vulnerable young people being drawn into dangerous situations because of impulsive decisions. "These moments of celebration come at a cost, Rosa," he explained. "The world has normalized practices that open spiritual doors we don't even realize. Parties, excesses, even the countdown to midnight. Many of these things are rooted in traditions that have turned people away from God for generations." I remembered the scenes he had shown before, the pagan celebrations that now seemed so distant yet so familiar. "So this is all wrong?" I asked, confused and struggling to reconcile what I saw with what I knew. "Not everything, but it's a matter of discernment," he replied. There are ways to celebrate life and time that don't involve these influences, but many don't question what they do, because traditions and ignorance keep them trapped. As I looked at the chaos and consequences of modern celebrations, a truth began to form in my mind. The greatest tragedy was not the fleeting joy or the festivities, but how disconnected people were from something greater, something eternal. The scenery changed again, and now I found myself in a place of indescribable vastness. It was an immense space, where everything seemed to be made of light and sound, but in a way that my earthly mind could barely comprehend. In the center, there was something that looked like a heavenly court. There were no robed judges, no wooden gavels. Everything was governed by an undeniable presence of justice and truth, and I knew I was in the presence of divine judgment. Jesus was next to me, but this time his expression was more serious. "Rosa, I want you to see the impact of choices made by those who say they follow me, not to judge, but to understand." Before me, scenes of trial began to emerge. One by one, people appeared: religious leaders, parents, young people, ordinary people, all in some way connected to the celebrations I had witnessed moments before. The first to be introduced was a pastor. He stood before the divine light, his hands shaking as his life was exposed in a series of visions. I saw how he had led his congregation, often with good intentions, but also with a desire to please people more than God. He had hosted New Year's parties within the church, with music, dancing, and modern connections, all to attract more members. He thought he was doing good, said Jesus, with a tone of compassion. But look at the consequences. The scene changed to show the members of his congregation. Some had lost themselves spiritually, as the celebrations within the church were no different from those in the world. Young people were drawn to practices that opened negative spiritual doors, while others began to question the seriousness of faith. The pastor cried, recognizing the unintended impact of his decisions. Then I saw a mother and a father. They were being shown moments in their lives when they participated in New Year celebrations with their children, mixing religious practices with popular traditions. They didn't know, I thought, but Jesus showed the result. His children grew up disconnected from deep spiritual values, prioritizing conformity to the world over following God. "Rose," he said, looking at me with compassionate eyes, "the responsibility of parents is great. Your actions take root in future generations, for better or for worse." I saw young people being judged, many of them involved in excesses and destructive behaviors during these celebrations. Some were Christians who believed that a night of innocent fun would have no major consequences, but the visions showed how small deviations led to big falls, accidents, addictions, destroyed relationships, all linked to seemingly harmless decisions. Finally, I saw ordinary people, those who followed traditions without questioning them. They did not intend to do harm, but they were trapped in cycles of ignorance. Still, Jesus showed no condemnation, only sadness over missed opportunities to live fully according to divine purposes. "Rosa," he said, his voice filled with indescribable weight, "I don't want anyone to perish, but they must understand that every choice has a spiritual consequence. Many follow me in words, but their hearts are far from me." I felt a deep pain in my heart. It was as if I was carrying the weight of the ignorance and consequences of all humanity. And at the same time, I saw a ray of hope. For those who sought the truth, there was always a chance for redemption. After the heavenly court, the environment changed again. This time, Jesus led me into a space that felt like an infinite gallery. It was like a museum, but there were no walls, ceiling, or floor. The scenes around me seemed suspended in a dimension beyond time, vibrating with a serene yet powerful energy. Each scene seemed to contain complete stories, alive and moving, like windows into realities that could have been. "This is the place where you will see what could have been," said Jesus, with a tone of solemnity. "Here are the missed opportunities, the paths that could have been followed if my people had chosen my ways rather than the ways of the world." The first vision showed a family. It was a familiar scene, parents and children around a table, celebrating a festival. But something was different. Instead of champagne and fireworks, there was a spirit of reverence and pure joy. They were celebrating one of God's appointed holy days, the Feast of Tabernacles. "See how keeping my commandments transforms lives," he said. "Here, This family has chosen to abandon the traditions of the world and dedicate these moments to me. The result is a spiritual and emotional unity that will bless future generations. I saw the children in that family grow up, rooted in strong values, becoming spiritual leaders and role models for their communities. Their choices created an impact that spread like waves, reaching people beyond what they could have imagined. The light radiating from that scene was so intense that I could almost feel it in my heart. Then Jesus showed another vision. It was an entire congregation gathered in an open field, celebrating Easter according to biblical commandments. There was singing, prayer, and deep spiritual connection. This community, which in another timeline had followed common New Year practices, now flourished in unity and purpose. They were free from the distractions and negative spiritual influences that had hindered their growth before. "These are the blessings I desire for my people," he said, with a tone of hope. "But many prefer to follow human traditions that keep them from the fullness I offer." Then, the scenes began to show contrasts. I saw young people who, instead of being carried away by parties and excesses, had chosen to dedicate their lives to serving God. I saw communities transformed by the observance of divine commandments, freed from spiritual confusion, and strengthened by a sense of eternal purpose. "But why can't so many people see this?" I asked, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. "Because the world is attractive," Jesus replied, with compassion in his voice. And the spiritual forces at work blind people to the consequences of their choices. It is easier to follow what is popular than to pursue what is right. Ultimately, he showed a vision of how divinely ordained celebrations could transform society on a large scale. There was peace, harmony, and a deep connection between people. It was a vision of what the world could be if everyone chose to live according to God's plans. When the visions ended, I felt a huge weight in my heart. It was not just sadness for lost opportunities, but also a renewed hope for what could still be restored. "Rose," he said, looking me in the eyes, "you cannot change the past, but you can testify to what you have seen. My people need to know that there is a better way, and that way begins with choosing to follow me completely." The gallery of missed opportunities disappeared, and I found myself once again surrounded by intense light. But now there was a sense of counter-movement. It was as if she was being pulled back, like a leaf being carried away by a current. The comforting warmth that had enveloped me throughout this journey began to dissipate, and in its place, a familiar chill of reality began to set in. "Rose," said Jesus, his voice echoing in my soul as the light around us began to dim. "You still have a purpose. What you have seen is not just for you, but for those who have not yet understood the implications of your choices. Live as a testimony and share what you learn, but do it with love and compassion." I wanted to ask more, to know more, but I felt an irresistible force pulling me away from his presence. "Wait," I begged, trying to stay there. "What if no one believes me? What if I fail?" He smiled, and that smile carried all the peace and certainty in the universe. "It's not your job to convince. Just plant the seed. The rest is up to me." It was at that moment that I felt an abrupt pull, as if I was being sucked into a vortex. The light around me became dim, and the sound of machines and people's voices calling my name began to penetrate my consciousness. I opened my eyes, blinking against the bright light of the emergency room. The heart monitor next to it made a rhythmic sound, a simple but comforting song of life returning. My vision was blurry, but I gradually began to make out the faces around me. Lucia was leaning over me, tears streaming down her face, while Dr. Ernesto let out a sigh of relief. "She's back," announced Ernesto, visibly exhausted but relieved. "Pink," Lucia said, holding my hand. "Oh, you scared me so much. Don't do that again." My mind was in turmoil. The experience I had just experienced seemed more real than the emergency room where I now found myself. I looked at the faces around me, the familiar sounds and smells of the hospital filling my senses, but something inside me had changed forever. Over the next few weeks, I struggled to process what had happened. I didn't talk to anyone about the experience initially, except Lucia, who insisted on knowing what I had seen. "It was more than I can explain," I told her hesitantly. "I saw Jesus. He showed me things that changed everything for me. I don't know how to tell you this without sounding crazy. Lucia didn't laugh, nor did she question me. Instead, he held my hand and said, "If he showed you something, there must be a reason. You need to find the courage to share it, even if no one understands." I reflected on his words. I knew it wouldn't be easy. We live in a world where spiritual experiences are viewed with skepticism. But what I had witnessed was bigger than my reputation or my personal concerns. It was a truth that needed to be told, even if only one person heard it. I left my job at the ER a few months later. It wasn't an easy decision, but I felt a calling to live in a way that was more aligned with what I had learned. I began working at a community clinic, helping people of all backgrounds with not only their physical needs, but also their spiritual needs whenever possible. I shared my story at appropriate times, with patients, friends, and even strangers who seemed to be searching for something bigger. It was not my mission to convince, but just to plant seeds, as Jesus had instructed me. Each day was a reminder that the choice between God's ways and the world's ways was more than a matter of tradition. It was a question of eternal life. Life, after my near-death experience, was a field of transformation. However, there were no major announcements or public statements. I decided to live discreetly, but deeply connected to the purpose that had been revealed to me. The change began with small choices, almost imperceptible to those around me, but which for me had an eternal weight. The first New Year after my return, I decided to do something completely different. While the world around me celebrated with fireworks, parties, and champagne, I set aside the night for prayer and reflection. There was no resentment toward those celebrating as always, but a determination in my heart that my life would be guided by something greater. The choice to live silently but determinedly did not come without challenges. There were times when I wondered if I was truly doing what Jesus had asked of me. How can I impact someone living like this, so out of the spotlight, I thought, as I walked to work at the community clinic. But every time that doubt arose, something happened. A patient shared a moment of vulnerability, an opportunity for comfort arose, or I simply felt that deep peace I had experienced in his presence. One such occasion occurred with a young mother named Sophia. She arrived at the clinic exhausted, carrying a crying baby and looking like she had lost all hope. "I don't know what to do," she said, almost collapsing in her chair. My husband left me, and I'm struggling to keep my faith." I felt a pang in my heart. It wasn't the first time I'd found someone lost in the chaos of life. Gently, I held his hand. "Sophia, you are not alone," I said, with a firmness that I knew was not mine, but came from the mission entrusted to me. I shared parts of my experience, not in detail, but enough for her to understand that there was hope, even in the most difficult circumstances. "If you saw all of this and you're still here, maybe God has a purpose for me too," she said, as she wiped away her tears. These little moments were my testimony. I didn't need a pulpit or an audience to fulfill what Jesus had shown me. All I had to do was be present, available, and live in a way that reflected the love and truth he had placed in my heart. The community around me started to notice changes. People asked me why I left the hospital, why I no longer participated in certain traditions, or why I seemed so focused on helping others without expecting anything in return. My answer was simple. I found a greater purpose. Some looked at me with skepticism, others with curiosity, but there were those, like Lucia, who understood deeply. "You've changed, Rosa," she said one day, "but it's a good change. I think you finally found what you were looking for." It was not easy to deal with criticism. There were those who said I was being extremist or old-fashioned. Even church members questioned why I avoided certain practices. But the truth that had been revealed to me was clear. Living for God does not always mean following what is popular, but what is right. Now, every New Year, my home is a place of peace and stillness. Instead of celebrating like before, I spend the day reflecting, praying, and being grateful for the life that has been given back to me. My story is not about condemnation, but about choice, the choice to live in alignment with an eternal purpose. As the years passed, I realized that my mission was not to change the entire world, but to reach those who were ready to listen, even if it was just a few. The most profound lesson I learned from my near-death experience was that spiritual transformation does not happen by force or imposition, but by each individual's choice. It was a January morning, about 2 years after my experience, when Lucia called me. She wanted to talk about a message she heard at her church about how traditions can be spiritually harmful when devoid of discernment. "Rosa," she said, "I remember you talking about this. Maybe you should tell your story to more people." I reflected on this for a moment, but my answer remained the same. "Lucia, my mission is not to convince. It is to live as an example. The choices I make are a way of showing what I have learned. Each person must decide for themselves." She was silent for a moment before responding. "You're right. Sometimes an example is more powerful than 1,000 words." This conversation echoed in my mind for weeks. I began to realize that my role was not just to live what I learned, but also to plant seeds of healthy doubt in the practices that people followed without question, not out of judgment, but out of love, to help them see what I had seen. One day at the clinic, I received a patient named Miguel, a man in his 50s who had survived a car accident on New Year's Eve. He was visibly shaken, both physically and emotionally. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "I was drunk, and it was a miracle that no one died." I felt a shiver. Miguel was a living reflection of what I had seen in my experience. "You're still here because there's something that needs to change," he said, holding her gaze. "Not everyone has the opportunity to start over. Use this as a gift." He nodded, and I saw something change in his eyes. It wasn't just remorse, but a determination to do differently. Sometimes it's these moments of vulnerability that open the door to better choices. Over time, I shared my story silently, in one-on-one conversations, in small groups, or even with strangers who seemed to be searching for something deeper. It didn't matter if they were close friends or complete strangers. I always trusted that God would put the right people in my path. The message was always the same: you have a choice. God does not force anyone to follow him, but he offers a better way, a way that brings life, peace, and purpose. It is not about human rules or traditions, but about living in alignment with what he has appointed. I still remember Jesus' final words before returning to my life. "Plant seeds, Rose, don't fear criticism, don't seek recognition. Just do your part, and the rest is up to me." These words became my compass, especially in times when I felt discouraged or questioned whether my journey made any difference. With each person I met, with each story shared, I realized that real change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the simple choices we make every day. Choose to love, forgive, live with purpose, and, above all, choose to follow the path that God has called us to walk. Today, when I look back, I see not only the experience that changed my life, but the quiet impact of a life lived with intention. There are no guarantees that everyone who hears my story will change, but I know I did my part. After all, it's everyone's choice